Hello again, everybody. So we talked really about kind of what I would call the initial policy response. I mean, Thomas has really laid out for you pretty sophisticated management of Great Salt Lake over time. I think policy is a little bit lagging behind that, and public awareness is lagging behind that. That's very much industry and agency folks working together. But what you can see now is, as I say on this, we really see a maturing policy response. So we see the legislature getting more engaged in terms of passing legislation designed to protect and to facilitate Great Salt Lake into the future. Now, it's not as clean as this slide suggests. It's not like the reports from the advisory council generated the media attention that generated the policy response. We certainly see some of that dynamic. So some of the case that's made really in these reports from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council do inform media coverage and reporting on the lake, and that is ultimately driving policymakers then to act in response. And you can see these are just some headlines. We've seen national and international coverage as the Great Salt Lake levels have declined. That's triggered some media attention. And then the silver lining is that's helped drive what I think is a positive policy response in reaction to that. Thomas, go ahead and hit the next slide. So I'm going to talk about some of those policy changes. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but just to give you a sense of the way the Utah legislature has responded to lower lake levels. We're going to talk about some of these, but you can see for many years, the only bill that we had on Great Salt Lake was that 2010 bill that established the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. The next piece of legislation was another 8 years before you saw a modest tweak to the brine shrimp royalty that helped fund some of these studies. But then we really saw in quick succession a bunch of policy changes. In 2019, I ran a resolution that was just designed to draw attention and awareness to Great Salt Lake. And then that set the path for some very significant legislation. These are sort of legislation that you see in 2020, and then additional funding in 2021. And then we really see a full flowering, really dramatic changes in 2022. And so we'll go into some of those in a little more detail. Next slide, Thomas. And I think this starts with, this is a resolution that I ran in 2019. And a resolution is something that doesn't have the force of law, but it simply says, listen, we as a state want to say Great Salt Lake is important, and here's why it's important. It's important because of the economic values that it supports. It's important because of the ecology, the birds, the brine shrimp that it supports. And so basically it says, listen, we, the legislature, recognize that it's important and we need to act in order to protect it. And the governor signs off on these resolutions. And one of the unique things about this particular resolution is that it said, listen, it said to the state agencies that have management authority, you really ought to convene a group of stakeholders to make recommendations about what to do as lake levels decline. And that's what that group did. Next slide, Thomas. So that group actually sat down over the course of, I think it was 6 to 9 months, and they developed a set of recommendations parallel to some of the recommendations that were coming out of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council that said, listen, here are some things that we need to do to ensure that adequate water gets to the Great Salt Lake to sustain it for today and for the future. And so it identified different opportunities that ought to be considered, ultimately made a series of recommendations about what should be done. Next slide. That just kind of gives you a little bit of a summary of what that report did. Again, it's very much in line with some of the other things that were done. A very significant piece of legislation that passed in 2020, and I was happy to be part of this, was 2 pieces of legislation, actually. One is on water banking, the other is on split leasing. The idea is just this. So water banking is just like this idea of money. So if you have funds, if you have money that you don't need, you can deposit those funds in a bank, and other people effectively can take money out of the bank. They're sort of using your money temporarily, and the bank pays you for that. A water bank works much the same way. So if I am using a block of water that's this big and I can get by with less, and I take that little block of water and I put it into a bank so that somebody else can use it. And our law didn't really allow for that to happen. And so we passed legislation designed to ensure that that could happen. The other thing is that under state law, in a given irrigation season, that's when you're taking water out of a natural system and using it, for example, to grow alfalfa, you can only use it to grow alfalfa. Well, part of this water banking concept is, hey, well, maybe for the first part of the year, the second part of the year, you want it to go into a natural system, you want it to go into a lake. And that's this idea of split seasons, how this can work at scale. So can, Thomas, if you could advance the next one. Alfalfa, which is a very important crop here in the state of Utah, is a good illustration for how this can work, because alfalfa is a crop that you can get a number of harvestable crops out of alfalfa in a given year, depending on how much water you get and what the climatic conditions are, temperatures and everything else. So if we take a typical, I call him Farmer John, and he's growing alfalfa, he'll typically get a first cutting of alfalfa. It typically does not require a lot of supplemental water because we have rain and snow, and snow over the winter, and then we have rain in the spring, and so the soils tend to be wet. And so he gets this very nice, high quality crop early in the year, and it takes very little supplemental water. He's going to have to use more water. The crop's not quite as good, and it takes a moderate amount of water. And then for his third crop of alfalfa, it's a marginal crop, so it's worse than the preceding two, but it takes the most water of all three. And so the idea and the concept is really this: can we go in a system and do something like this, where we say, hey, for that farmer, if I pay you the economic value of your third crop, can you then put that water into the bank? And then an environmental need like Great Salt Lake can take that water out of it. So and put it into the environment when the environment needs it most. And so you can see the water moving from the farmer to the natural environment, in this case, the Great Salt Lake, and the money flowing from interests that are interested in the lake back to that farmer. Next slide, Thomas. What this does is really opens up the possibility for what we call a win-win situation. So that's where everybody benefits. The farmer benefits and the natural system benefits. So you can see there's some really advantages to this system. Number one is, in a wet year, if there's a lot of water around, we don't have to trigger it. We can just leave it be, let people use water the way that they normally do. But if there's dry years or the lake hits certain elevations, this can trip in. The farmer is made whole economically, so they're not harmed at all in this transaction. They get the money that they need, and then the ecosystem gets a significant block of water. Again, if it's just one farmer, that's not a lot of water, but if you do many participants, 100 or 1,000 farmers participating, suddenly we can generate a very significant block of water for an environmental use like Great Salt Lake. There are, of course, some challenges with these systems. One is financial. You've got to find a way to pay for the water to make those farmers whole. And there's just some technical requirements. We have to be able to measure where water is used to ensure that it actually gets to where it's needed. And then there's just some legal regulatory requirements, again, making sure that water that's saved maybe way up in the headwaters actually makes it all the way down to Great Salt Lake. Nevertheless, a very interesting opportunity that was authorized in 2020, and we're testing these systems right now. So you can see that in 2022, so this was this year, our local media called it the year of the Great Salt Lake, and it really was a remarkable year from a policy standpoint. The picture on the left, it's a little bit hard to see, that's the governor of the state of Utah, Spencer Cox, and he decided to announce his state budget from the shores of the Great Salt Lake. And actually, it's hard to see, but that's the Great Salt Lake that's behind him. And he announced his budget on the shores of the Great Salt Lake to draw attention to this resource and the need to protect it. On the right, you can see that's House Speaker Brad Wilson, so one of the key legislative leaders, and he decided to make Great Salt Lake a priority, and so he hosted a summit back in January for policymakers and for local elected officials and for the media to help draw attention to the lake. Next slide. And what all of this did was generate enormous policy response for Great Salt Lake. So I want to be clear, this is just this year. So where over a decade, we maybe had 2 bills dealing with Great Salt Lake, you can see that this year, the bills that you see in bold, those first 6 bills, all do something direct about Great Salt Lake. And then the last 4 all have indirect implications for Great Salt Lake. But you put them all together, this is an enormous amount of policy dealing with Great Salt Lake. You can see watershed enhancement. You can see something that funded a comprehensive study of water supply for Great Salt Lake. You can see something that improves policy response for Great Salt Lake, and then some things, really important things about funding and the way that we fund it into the future. But bottom line, an enormous amount of legal and policy efforts this year. Next slide, Thomas. So just to talk briefly about a few of these, House Speaker Brad Wilson, again, the Speaker of the House, we sort of have the governor, and then we have the President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House is our most important kind of political figures in the state of Utah. The Speaker of the House rarely runs legislation, but he felt so strongly about Great Salt Lake that he ran this bill called Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement, and it basically creates a trust to protect water supplies for the lake. And then the bill deposited $40 million into that trust, $30 million for water supply and about $10 million for connected habitats, because of course birds, and there's other habitats that are outside the boundaries of the lake but are important to the lake and its ecosystem. So there was $10 million to protect those. Next slide. And then there is another bill that was important that basically just, again, talks about an integrated water assessment for Great Salt Lake. How is water getting in? How's it being used? Where can we find efficiencies and that sort of thing? And that was funded as well. Next slide. And then a bill that I ran deals with something called the Sovereign Lands Management Account, but this really deals with long-term funding for the lake. So the biggest industry from Great Salt Lake are the mineral extraction, the kind of stuff that you see there on the left. And those royalties, again, come into the state, and then they're often used for other purposes that don't benefit the lake. What this bill said is, listen, where this lake is generating revenue, then let's use that revenue to protect the lake itself. And as new minerals come online, lithium is very important in rechargeable batteries. As mineral companies start harvesting lithium from Great Salt Lake, then let's earmark those funds to protect the lake and its water supply. So it really creates, again, the opportunity for kind of win-win solutions. And the last one that I think is really important, and this reflects a decade or more worth of work, is to enhance the legal framework so that we can recognize that water that flows into the lake is valuable and then it can be protected. And that bill passed this last session as well, and a very important bill for the future ability to protect Great Salt Lake. Next slide. So just to talk about the funding piece, again, the most money I'd ever seen allocated to Great Salt Lake was in 2021. It was about $1 million in US. So 1 million US. And this year we saw direct appropriations for Great Salt Lake, $50 million US. And then indirect appropriations, things that have indirect benefits on the Great Salt Lake, almost $375 million US were invested. One of those is secondary metering. That's just measuring water that's used on homes and businesses, but generates significant water savings when it's implemented. Putting money into agriculture. A lot of times a farmer can incorporate new technologies that save a lot of water, but they can only do so if they have some assistance from the government. So we put $75 million into that, and then $50 million for Great Salt Lake. Again, as I said, about $30 million for water supply, about $10 million for habitat improvement, $5 million for that comprehensive assessment, and $5 million to build that adaptive management berm that Thomas was talking about to manage salinities between the North and South Arms. So significant, huge investments in Great Salt Lake this year. Why did all that happen at once? And I'd say, number one, Utah has a long tradition of collaboration, particularly when it comes to long-term, systemic problems. Utah just has a real reputation of working together, and you see that reflected in the policy response. That comes out of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council helped building the case to do something. That's supported by media coverage about declining lake levels. So where your average citizen 5 years ago wasn't thinking about Great Salt Lake, if you ask them now, many of them are starting to be concerned about the lake and be interested in the lake. And then we see political leaders responding to that and saying, okay, here's an important resource for the state. We need to protect it. It's important to the state's future. It's important to its economy, and it's important to its environment. And so the last thing, and I think this is a little bit serendipity, is having legislators who are concerned about the lake, legislators like myself, but also we have other legislators that are concerned about the Great Salt Lake, having them in positions of authority and influence where they can help steer resources to these efforts is also very, very important. So when you step back and think about the presentations that Thomas has given this morning and the presentations that I've given this morning, what I hope you see is really, again, the spirit of cooperation and collaboration, people working together. You can see that a bunch of stakeholders came together to figure out how to manage the Artemia resource in a sustainable way. Really come together not just on Artemia, but to help manage things like salinity and nutrients. You can see that there is a lot of engagement and cooperation between various research institutions, between the state, universities, and then state agencies, and even industry in terms of cooperating together and sharing information. And then you can see really a great spirit of cooperation between the legislature on the one hand and the governor on the other. And so the last thing I really want to do is just talk about a little bit of a look forward. What do we see happening over the next little bit in terms of the sustainable management of Great Salt Lake? One is installation of that causeway berm so that we can manage salinity better into the optimal ranges in the South Arm. This trust, the legal framework for the trust has been established, but the trust itself can be set up to help protect water supply for the lake. We can see actual real world testing of some of these legal policy changes that have been made over the past couple of years, and that's happening right now. But then those have to be scaled up and applied to Great Salt Lake. We can see some limitations on groundwater withdrawals and other actions to protect water as it flows into the lake. And lastly, greater legal recognition for the water that's already there. Thomas, next slide. So given all those changes, I choose to be quite positive, quite optimistic about the lake and its future. This is a painting that comes from Utah's heritage. So Utah is famous for pioneers. They were groups of immigrants that moved from the eastern United States into the desert, really, that Utah is. But they had a great tradition of taking the long view of things. The first thing they did when they got here, within hours of arriving in the valley, which were then dry desert valleys, is they diverted some of the water for a local creek to grow potatoes for the next season. And so they have this view of working together and taking the long view, and that still defines Utah politics today, and it really defines the response that we've had towards Great Salt Lake.